Welcome back to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast, where we will explore the local arts culture and community in the Lehigh Valley. We'll be doing this through conversations with individual artists, administrators, and organizations. We'll discuss all types of mediums with the goal of enriching local arts culture.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast. I am Ben, and today we are recording live from Doug Boehm's studio at the Banana Factory. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Also with is Elise.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Doug, for having us here.
Excellent.
Your studio is
always
awesome.
welcome. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we've been trying to get you on for like a year now. I'm glad that it finally worked out.
Yeah, I remember when you initially asked me about it, I'm like, I want to do it, but I don't have anything to kind of report. And then since I do have this big show coming up, I thought, hey, maybe now would be the time.
I like the efficiency. I don't have anything to report, so I'm not ready.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I wait for the big things, not the day-to-day.
Elise, would you mind reading Doug's bio for us?
Sure. Doug Boehm is a painter and illustrator whose personal work has been shown in galleries throughout the United States and collected in the US, UK, Australia, and Taiwan. His illustration work has graced the pages of national publications and tour posters. Doug lives in Pennsylvania with his wife and 3 children.
Well, Doug, we are sitting in your studio here at the Banana Factory, surrounded by what looks like many, many years of your work.
A lifetime of artwork.
Yes, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how you got here to the Banana Factory.
So I've been here for about 5 years. What happened was I have a very small house, and I have 3 kids, and I gave them all my space at my house. I had a studio at my house, and then for a while it was in my basement. And for quite some time, I have twin daughters. I have a little boy who's 11. My daughters are 7. And when the girls were born, I essentially stopped painting completely for about 2 solid years. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple life instances that occurred that inspired me to start painting again. And my space was so limited. We were considering getting a larger house, actually, so we could upgrade, have more space, have a studio space in my basement. But the idea of, again, having a space in the basement versus having a studio, there was a lot to weigh there. My wife and I were also pretty overwhelmed with having still these young twins and my son and everything. So rather than just completely uprooting, I applied for a space here. And so that was really the practical reason. It's like very practical. It's very close to my house. It's 2 minutes down the road. However, when this place first opened, I remember walking through, being pretty enamored with all the different artists here in different spaces. So I applied, and when I got in, it was really a lot changed with my art. I was able to scale up a little bit, get a little bigger, and I just started painting like lots and lots of paintings on paper, on canvas, on board. I was able to bring my kids here on the weekend so they could take part in it. And then eventually, right now I'm at a point where I'm here a lot of the time, weekends, a lot of weekdays as well. Overall, it's been good to me from the standpoint that it's a great place to actually physically get artwork done, especially the new studio. I was in a location down the hall in a much smaller space initially for a couple of years. And then during the pandemic, this larger space with these great windows and everything became available. And I was able to even get larger with my work and get even more paintings out the door here. It's been great from that standpoint. Also, it's been great to have other artists around. I got to meet lots of great people. Lots of musicians actually have come through and I've befriended over the years of my stay here. Yeah. So it's overall positive experience.
When did you start painting?
In terms like actual painting, it's funny. I was always a creative kid, literally ever since I was very young, 5 years old. I'm the youngest of 3 kids. My sister's 8 years older than me. My brother's 5 years. So, whenever they would do homework when they were in school, I would sit at the table with them and draw, And I feel like it got me a little bit of attention as a young kid, sort of like my brother and sister got a little bit more of the attention. And then I'm there like, hey, remember me? And so I think drawing certainly, got me a little bit of attention, even at school. I was telling someone the other day that one of my earliest artistic business transactions, I was probably in first grade, maybe first or second grade. This one kid that I went to school with knew that I could draw, and he's like, "Hey, can you draw a tank for me, or can you draw like this other it was like vehicles of destruction or something, And I remember saying, "Sure, I'll draw that for you," and he was really into it, and he actually paid me in these little tiny muscle men. I don't know if you remember, like from the '80s, there's like little tiny guys, like wrestlers and different creatures. So yeah, so I've been doing art and drawing and that since I was very young. But in terms of actual painting in this style, I'll just say it's probably been 20 years. 2002, 2003, I started focusing a little bit more energy on personal work. Or prior to that, I went to Tyler School of Art, graduated in 2001, focused most of my energy on illustration, editorial illustration. And then by way of developing that style, that my editorial style, I think what you see in front of you here, this is like the product of all those years, working under crazy deadlines, cranking out illustrations in this kind of overall style that you might see some of these pieces on over here. Yeah, the whole texture, that was certainly a carryover from my illustration work into my personal realm. So yeah, and then I would say about 20 years of starting to dabble a little bit more aside from illustration and starting to focus more on personal work.
I know that you've done poster work as well for bands and even for Music Fest.
Yep.
Did that help bridge that gap between the painting and that illustration?
Yeah, it definitely did. I think the posters are equally as much about the band as they are personal. Sure. I actually incorporate some, personal mythology, my own storytelling into these posters. There's lots of different apes, and some of them have tentacles, and other certainly skeletons and other things that I painted for years. Like I've painted so many skulls and skeletons and that kind of stuff in my life. I don't do a whole lot of that anymore, but sometimes it comes up. I do believe that having access and being able to do posters certainly created that bridge between my commercial editorial work and the more personal work. Mm-hmm. And then, those posters sort of come around. I'm not constantly making posters, but, I might do a poster once a year, every other year, kind of keep it fresh. I would much rather, in my current sort of compartmentalized time, I would rather focus on my own paintings, just kind of whatever I want to do. And I always feel like if I'm able to just kind of disconnect from, a project or a job, it makes it more authentic. And I start, incorporating more personal mythology into my work.
It's interesting. A couple people that we've talked to, or just people that I've worked as illustrators, maybe even before they got kind of into their own personal painting or like style of work. Yeah. Sometimes it's like very either one or the other, run into this issue of like the need to like crank stuff out really quickly. And it's stressful, or the ability to crank stuff out really quickly because you're so used to working on like this very strict deadline kind of workflow. How do you feel like that has translated for you?
Well, I can paint really fast. So, yeah, I can, I don't really spend, a lot of times people are like, oh my gosh, do you spend like 80 hours on that? Like this large one over here. I do not spend 80 hours on a painting. I tend to, I think the most I've ever spent on a painting, maybe 20 hours. And that was, there's a really large painting down around the hallway that's this king. And I kind of had it in the background as I was doing other paintings. I like to work on a lot of different things at the same time, especially when the ball's rolling. That was an extreme. Usually it's like 10 hours, something like that.
Wow.
I'd like to, I'll spend time developing the idea way before I actually start painting. Especially now that I'm using these panels that are really, they're very permanent. At least it seems to me. It's like it's going to last forever. It's going to outlive me for sure. So because of that, I do plan out. I do sketches and kind of think about the total body of work. So there's a little bit of time there, but the actual painting time, once the ball's rolling, it's go time, and I know where I'm going. There's a little bit of improv along the way. Like if I compare the actual final piece to the sketch, there's usually things that deviate from the plan, and that's life, right? It's like you can plan, have a plan, don't make it too specific, and then in the end, just kind of go with the flow a little bit.
Do you find your sketches of the pieces beforehand to have the palette already included, or are they more black and white?
Typically black and white, and some of them are like really kind of cartoony, very like comic book-ish. That when you see the final piece, the texture and the color and just sort of the dripping and all this other stuff, it starts to kind of remove itself from that, illustrative, illustrator type comic look. Sometimes the underpaintings, I've actually had a couple artists in here like, wow, I didn't realize your underpaintings look so like graphic novel or something, And then as I start to layer color and other things on top, it starts to take a life of its own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In artists that work in similar line and style, there's a lot of debate whether they want to use a projector to help get those fine lines or freehand it from the beginning. What do you tend to find yourself doing?
I love composition, just the placement of elements and form and all of those terms that go along with it. Usually the sketch is pretty tight in terms of the composition, and it's obviously at a much smaller scale. So it depends. There's definitely paintings in this room where I very much just started painting, or sometimes I might just take like a Vine charcoal and just do very basic forms to just get the overall essence, and then I'll start. So my approach is very specific to the individual piece. I've done everything from that, like this very free form type approach, to very rigid, with the projector. I actually have a projector up there.
Nice.
If it's a large piece, like maybe I'll use a projector for this piece that's, 5 feet wide. But, more often than not, I will take the sketch, blow it up at Staples, the size of the canvas, and I'll do a transfer.
Okay.
Another thing I like to do, very recently, making stencils. Like especially the landscapes. You might notice if you start looking at my work, sometimes you'll see, that's like the green version or the verde version, right? Of the original, like that print over there. That was one of the first landscapes I had done. I love that composition. So I had made a stencil of that. And I have a green version and I have sort of a nighttime version. I'm actually really into this idea of doing an AM version and a PM version. So this king painting over here was the, not a stencil, but that's the PM version. And I actually did exactly the same piece that had sold. That's the AM version. So it's very light. So some of the newer work that I've done, it's exactly the same painting, but it's the AM and the PM version based on the fact that I have access to the stencil. But every piece is very unique. And the stencil is just there to make sure that I maintain some level of symmetry. And then at some point, symmetry kind of goes out the window, and it's no longer about symmetry. It's just about the color balance and so on. So
it's so interesting looking at your pieces in person here, because some of them they're very symmetrical, they're very geometric and balanced, but some are also very like biomorphic, and there's this extremely naturalistic line through all of it that I think is really beautiful. I'm looking at the wall right in front of me. It just has so much green. And I really like that part of your work. And you've kind of been alluding to like characters and storytelling and graphic novels, comic books, but this lore that's behind your work, do you feel like it's very interconnected, or it's kind of like these separate characters that make appearances in your work?
Well, what you were saying about how some of them are symmetrical, some of them are not, and like just some very organic forms and so on. The symmetrical work is relatively new. I haven't been doing symmetrical work for 20 years. That's very recent. Probably even during, maybe just before the pandemic started, I probably did my first symmetrical. And the reason it took so long for me to get to that space is I remember being in school, specifically, I went to school for graphic design and illustration, and if you want to make your image dynamic, asymmetry is the way to go. It was always like the mantra. It has to be asymmetrical. Even if you're doing a figure drawing or something like that, like one of the hands should be slightly smaller so that it gives it this depth. And I remember being kind of trained or taught to kind of steer away from symmetry. But man, there's so much cool stuff out there that's symmetrical. And I'm thinking about, tapestries. I'm thinking about, a lot of printmaking, look at Rorschachs, look at, there's a lot of cool stuff that's come out of symmetry. Symmetry has done a lot for humanity. Okay. So I remember doing my first symmetrical piece that also happened to be one of my first landscapes. And that was because I just wrote my artist statement for this upcoming show that I'm in. And I very much reveal, sort of my mentality around it. It's a very personal story. So in 2019, my dad passed away. So obviously, devastating for myself and my family. And it was sort of a long time coming, and I felt prepared for it. But regardless of how you spin it, you're never really prepared for it. So I took time to reflect, and I definitely, after that happened, even before he actually passed away, I feel like I started focusing more energy on my art because it helped me. It was therapeutic, right? Going through hard times, I think music and art and just creativity helps, right? But I remember reflecting about just how everything occurred, and even before that, I remember sharing one of the very first landscapes that I had done with my dad. And I told him that, my dad was not an artist, but he was always supportive of what my interests were, in terms of art. And, he didn't really have a connection to art museums or any of this kind of stuff, but it was more, he understood that I had a talent, right? And he wanted to be supportive of it, regardless of how supportive he was of it. And same thing would apply to my mom. I remember at a very young age, I started doing very bizarre artwork, right? It was like all skulls, it was like heavy metal album covers were like my big, heavy metal album covers, skateboard graphics, and comic books, were like my big inspirations because it was very accessible. It was print. You can go to any store and pick up a comic book. And I was into skateboarding at the time, but because of that and that influence, my work started taking on, pretty bizarre topics. And I remember my dad like, "Oh, why don't you ever draw anything nice?" It's like, and I've heard him say that so many times. And, it's like, of course, when I got out of college and I started making money doing it, it was like, that's all right. That's cool. But I remember so many times, why don't you ever paint like a mountainside, like a nice landscape, a meadow, or some deer, because, my dad and I were very much into the outdoors. And so, I thought to myself, maybe he's right. I thought, hey, what if, I'm really bummed out about everything going on. So why not, do a landscape? Why not? It's a people pleaser, right? Why not tap into that? So it's really sort of very close to his death. I had done one of my very first landscapes, and I started posting them on Instagram, and people were like, "Oh my gosh!" It was in my style and the textural aspect of everything that I've kind of led up to at this point.
Yeah.
But it was also symmetrical, right? So it was breaking the trend of going asymmetrical on all of my paintings to symmetry and the subject matter, rather than being figurative or a creature or something bizarre or had another meaning. Like for a while, I was into the central nervous system. I painted the central nervous system many times. I painted kings and queens many times. I painted, you can see this piece here. It's a pretty old piece. I painted probably 50 or 50 to 60 of those pink and blue apes, right? So it's like, my work was kind of all over the place in terms of subject matter. But when I did that landscape, I remember showing it to him. It was probably like literally months before he passed. And he said, "That's great." He really liked it. And I think that people really do enjoy the landscapes because they're this meditative, right? Yeah. And this new body of work that I'm developing that's currently going to be shown opening on Friday, I also brightened up the colors. I was in this green phase. You mentioned it. You saw it right away. I've painted so many green paintings, and there's a whole story behind why I was in this whole green phase. But I brightened up the colors during the pandemic specifically. I'd already started painting landscapes in this symmetrical style. But I deliberately went the opposite, and I started brightening my colors up and exploring more with a wider range of full spectrum of color. People really, it's meditative, it's a positive message, but then there's also this other angle to those images where I was mentioning to you earlier that people see things in them, because of the symmetry, that Rorschach, right? Or Gestalt, is it a face? Is it what is that? Is it a bird's wing? Is it, is it a person? Is it this, that, or the other? And that fascinates me, the idea that it was not intended to look anything like that, and people see it, and maybe I didn't even see it that way,
I like that concept of like you're responding to how people see your work, because people want to interpret artwork based on your personal background or your personal interests. You might not have any interest or knowledge of Rorschach, or you might not care about any of it, but it's cool to I think it's really cool when people look at artwork and they're like, oh, this is what I see it's all based on personal experience. Yeah. That's really cool.
Well, the symmetry aspect, I have 3 that I'm doing over there. That will be probably the last symmetrical pieces I do for a while. I'm taking a break from it. Wow. I have lots of other ideas for new themes and other things that I want to do. But, that's how I kind of do it. I'll work on something until it's done, until it's like all my energy spent on it. And then it's like, man, I got to do something new. That's why, when I think about artists that have maintained a career for 60 years or something, and it's like, there's been many where their work in their 20s looks so similar to, their 70s. And, it's like they're giving people what they want and what they're famous for. But for me, I want to be able to paint a landscape, do an abstract, do a king, paint a king or a figurative piece or this, that, and the other, and still somehow make it feel like it all goes together.
Sure.
And, I tend to get bored pretty quick. So the idea of, the next body of work is going to be symmetrical landscapes, I'm kind of like, let me pump the brakes for a while and figure out something new as a palette cleanser.
It's a very efficient way of thinking. Yeah. You're like, and then in the next phase, I will.
Yeah. I'll get back to it.
I'll compartmentalize my ideas ahead of time. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'd mentioned a story surrounding why you use green.
Oh, yeah.
I would love to hear that.
Yes. I painted, I don't know how many paintings in green, but my house is green. It's like this yellowish green. A lot of colors internationally mean different things as well. Like sometimes red might be very offensive in a certain culture, and some others it's very passionate, where green is one of the misconfused colors. It has so many positive connections to green. It's like, it's, spring and nature and all these really, fresh, new, right? Green, very calming, right? And then it also has this really negative connotation. It's greed, it's money, it's envy. People, if you're not educated on a topic, they'll call you green, right? So it's totally, it's divisive color. And I also think that a lot of people either love green. There's also a lot of people that just don't like green, right? In terms of, it's just one of those divisive colors. But one of the reasons I love painting with green, it's, the type of green that I use creates a very nice sort of neutral ground. So I do like the meaning of it. Specifically, some people again, see it totally differently. Where, if it's blue, a lot of people love blue, right? It's like calming and all this. Where green, especially, it's this sort of like acid green. A lot of the greens that you see in my work, that was like indicative of like so many paintings that I had done. I also like, in terms of things that have dual meanings, kings have this dual meaning as well. Like some people want to be the king, right? They want to be the king. It's like revered. And other people don't like the king, right? Or just the whole idea of royalty, So for me, painting subjects that might potentially have dual meanings, snakes, right? In Christian culture, it's negative, right? In other cultures, it's totally positive. There's actually a culture that believes that if you eat a snake, you actually live forever, right? So it's just interesting how people see a symbol and they feel one way or the other, right? Some people love snakes. Some people are my dad was terrified of snakes. Anything snake-like, he was terrified of it. Probably the most, like the symbol that I've painted the most, the visual symbol, water. So, and water is also, it's like, you need water to survive, right? It could be really dangerous. It could be life-threatening. You can be floods and drowning and just the power of the ocean, right? Where, it's this thing that everyone needs, but it could be incredibly dangerous. So, I like those themes where that's like the drama of the art that I do.
Oh, I love it though, because it takes this idea of color theory and really helps bring a sense of understanding to the subject material that you're painting.
Yeah. And then of course, like the orange started to kind of pop. It's pretty risky, doing this like acid green with orange, right? You're like, oh, it's kind of really jarring. It's one of those things where if you saw them separately, this is the orange color, this is the green color, not in the same painting, you'd be like, that's terrible. That's not going to work. That's just not going to work. But, sometimes I like that idea of taking things that shouldn't work and then you put them together and next thing you know, you have something that's new.
Yeah, definitely. I'm seeing a lot of these repeated themes, whether it be horses or skulls or mountains, nature, eyes.
Monkeys.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mushrooms.
Yeah.
Where do you find yourself drawing most of your inspiration?
Well, I do think that nature, it's such a classic theme, right? Nature. So I do think, growing up, that was one of the big things with my dad and my family, like just spending time in nature, fishing, hunting, hiking, just generally hanging out in open spaces. So that was always inspiring to me. And after, turning 20 or so, I certainly ventured out. I've been to a bunch of national parks and I have a high respect for even just the environment in general. I think I would consider both my wife and my family to be pretty environmentally conscious, respecting the beauty of what's out there. I like gardening as well. So like, I think the green is also relative to that. But in terms of, the whole ape thing, that pink and blue ape that you see here, and there's also another one up in the top.
Yeah.
I think I only have 2 of those left, but I painted those a lot. And the first time I had painted those, I took part in this show. I don't even know if they still do them anymore, but Vans would sponsor the Sneaker Pimp show. And it was usually more of a West Coast thing. The shows that I've taken part in were on the West Coast. And they would send different artists slip-on Vans and you'd paint them up and then take part in a show. And the one that I had that initial one that I had taken part in was in Portland, Oregon. And, it's like I'm sitting there in front of these sneakers, these white sneakers, like, what am I going to do, with this? And it was left and right, so I'm thinking, is it stereo, left and right shoes? I do think that there was something out there that, just this whole idea of, evolution and everything, it's like, again, connecting to nature and I just landed on apes. It was just something I was sketching and doodling, and next thing you know, I'm doing apes. Apes are very popular. You've seen a reinsurgence of those NFT apes, right? And I remember talking to some folks about that, like, oh my God, you should do NFTs of those, right? So
You had the apes before they were cool.
Yeah, I was doing the apes before they were on NFT. Yeah, that was, what year is that? Is that 2008 maybe? Yeah, maybe 07. Again, I think that Sneaker Pimp show that I mentioned was probably 05 or so. I painted these two apes. I'm like, what if you alternate pink and blue, right? So there's no gender associated with it if it's together. They're twins, kind of twins. This whole idea, like, I love music, so this whole stereo idea. They're wearing headphones with like transmitters on them or something. I had a little story about them that they're not even from this planet. So it just evolved from this sneaker that I had painted into many, many other paintings based on them. And then, the other story behind those particular characters, years later, I ended up having twins, right? So I guess the years of manifesting twins out into the universe, now I have twins of my own. Yeah. And then, of course, even recently, the recent Primus poster that I had done this year features an ape. And, I also, depending on the type of music, that is certainly, it's a classic, iconic theme, right? Apes, evolution, in terms of, nature's I do like classic themes, and then having my own spin on it, kings and queens and snakes. These are they're all very classic and have been painted by many other artists over and over again. And, I think everything has essentially been done. It's very rare that you see an artist, especially a contemporary artist, where like, that's completely 100%, not derivative of anything. So, even some of the artists here that you might see, you can, I was actually having a conversation about music with somebody recently, and it's like I was listening to a song that kind of sounds like this other band, right? People do that. And people come into my studio and they're like, oh, that kind of looks like this. And it's because people set their own meaning to things, or they have their own vernacular, or whatever you want to call it. They're like, oh, it looks like Samurai Jack. That was one of the, I can't remember what one of my pieces that somebody thought it looked like Samurai Jack, or they thought it looked like, I remember somebody coming through, oh, it looks like your stuff looks like Tim Burton. And that's a very limited view, right? And I'm like, right. I don't really see that. People have referenced lots of different things over the years because there's such classic themes that people, again, put their own meaning and reference their own experience. And, that piece over there with the skulls and the horses and all that, like I've definitely painted the four horsemen several times over throughout the course of my career here. And that was a more recent one. And, I painted that during the pandemic because everyone thought, this is like the end, The fact that I started painting brighter colors and, to deliberately get myself out of that mindset. That was one of the pieces that I had done during that time frame where like everything's going to be okay. We're all going to get through this. So, showing this extreme image of the four horsemen with flowers and vines growing out of their bodies and so on seemed to be appropriate for the time.
Well, in there, you'd mentioned about work, you'd mentioned about family, and obviously, since you're here, you have an art practice. What does it look like for you to balance all of those responsibilities?
Yeah, my time is definitely compartmentalized. It's like anything else. If something brings you meaning and it's important to you, you make time for it. Yeah, it's tough. It's very difficult to balance. Fortunately, my wife is very supportive of my art. Both her and I went to art school together. And so she understands that, we both need to kind of get out, and do our own things separate from the family from time to time. Like, like once a week or so, I'll get to go do my paintings. A lot of times I'll wait for the kids to go to bed before I even come here. This is like a late night practice here. Yeah. So my wife is, I think without her and her level of understanding, it would probably be very difficult for me to get the amount of art out the door that I produce. But, it's time management, really. However, I will also say, as I was working through the show, unfortunately, some things got pushed off, like at home, so now I'm catching up. I'm going through the basement, right? For
Sure.
example, it's like getting back to reality rather than living in my art cloud. So yeah, I think that, my kids also enjoy coming to the space. They're very, very creative kids as well. My son is turning out to be an artist as well, or at least a visual creative person. He also plays guitar. So he's taking on, it's like, I'm not pushing. I don't want to be like one of these dads where it's like, oh, the kids are doing, they need to play football because I played college football or high school football. I'm not like that.
Yeah.
I'm definitely not a sports person, but I'm just drawing that analogy where, I'm an artist, so therefore they have to be an artist or some kind of creative person. But I do think that because it's kind of all I talk about and do, and, most of our outings, a lot of our outings it's either nature or art. Those are the two things.
For sure.
And that just happens to be what I'm interested in. And he's certainly absorbing, my son specifically. My daughters are starting to really get involved in making little comic books as well.
Yeah.
My daughter Emma is getting piano lessons and Ayla's getting drum lessons. So yes, I'm creating a family band and we're going to be going on the road together. I'm just kidding. So yeah, I think having the fact that they're interested in the creative world, imagination and whatever else you want to call it, it makes it a little bit easier for me to break away and do the work that I do. I will say doing a solo show is very difficult. It's almost to the point where it's almost nonsensical for me to I'm going to create a solo show, or I'm going to create 15 paintings in a year. That's a lot of paintings.
Sure.
If you want to make each one unique and meaningful based on the level of compartmentalization that I have going on in my life. So I think for a while, I need to take a break. I'm going to do a few paintings at a time. I love doing a bunch of paintings at the same time, though. I very rarely work on one painting. Usually it's like, I'll work on this painting, and then I'm going to switch over to something else, or I'll have a series in mind.
Sure.
I do think more in series than just a one-off. And then sometimes a one-off, if I do end up doing a one-off, it turns into a series.
Well, as I'm looking around, I'm seeing your work on beer cans and guitars, books. Is that a snowboard back there?
Yeah.
A snowboard, mugs, like all sorts of near everyday objects.
Yeah.
What's your interest in combining art with everyday objects like that?
So I love painting on canvas. I love painting on these boards that I've been painting on. I am definitely more of a 2D type artist, but I do think that when you paint on a guitar, or when you paint on a book, or you paint on a 3D object, all of a sudden that's the thing that people want to talk about. That's like the big conversation piece, Oh my gosh, what are those? Oh, those are books, and like those pieces over here. Sealed up books, never to be read, and it takes on a whole other meaning. So I do think that, like I was mentioning about even that the orange and the green, like they're kind of like, okay, well, you smash them together and do it in a certain way. All of a sudden it's this unique thing. It's the same thing with you take an object and then you paint on it. Suddenly it's this whole other thing. My time is fairly compartmentalized, so I have to be really kind of efficient with how I approach. I think if I did have more time, I would probably consider painting more 3D objects, maybe larger 3D objects. The guitars are fairly new in terms of my fascination, and the guitars were, I'm friends with some local musicians that had kind of acquired through them, and I love painting guitars. Like I could actually see myself at some point, maybe years from now, who knows, but focusing more energy on that. Doing geometric designs, which again, even geometric designs, it was something that was pretty not characteristic of some of my previous work. And I do feel like during the pandemic, I think a lot of people, including myself, it was like licensed to kind of just explore and do whatever, like whatever you want, And even if it's totally different from what you were doing before, it was fine, I would love to paint a whole car at some point, or like go bigger. That's like, if I could somehow make arrangements to do like a mural with like a series of cars in front of it that are painted, that would certainly be appealing to me.
Awesome.
I love painting on 3D objects, for sure.
Well, I would love to next dive into the piece that you presented us.
Yeah.
We can, let's start with an audio description of that piece.
All right. So this piece is titled Mother of the Mountain. It's acrylic on panel done in 2022 by Doug Boehm and is 30 inches by 40 inches. This artwork is a stylized mountain scene in portrait orientation. The texture is rough and scraped in appearance. The central colors are soft and cool blues and greens with a bit of pale yellow. In the foreground is a deep, crevicing valley with cracks and ridges that run horizontally and point towards the center of the artwork. The center between the ridges is dark, and a small green circle sits in the depths below the crevice. As we travel up the piece, we enter a mountain range that has many layers of organically shaped mountains that point towards the sky. Some mountain peaks are short, and taller mountains layer behind them. Waving pale yellow lines travel along the mountain ridges, revealing their naturalistic shape and topography. A narrow yellow sky at the top of the piece centers around a black circle where the sun should be. A very straight central line travels from the green circle in the depths of the artwork to the folds of the mountain ranges and points towards the eclipsed sun at the top of the piece. So this is one of your newer pieces.
Yes.
And I think the description fails to communicate how symmetrical it is.
Yeah. Yeah, going back to that symmetry thing. It's part of this new show, and it's certainly one of the show pieces. There's two larger pieces that are the show pieces, this being one, and then the other one is a totally different composition and a totally different color palette. The other one is very bright, very warm, lots of pinks and reds and oranges, and this one is very blue and very kind of calm and cooling. And it almost has this like fire and ice type kind of connection when they're together. They were certainly the show pieces, the big kind of reveal pieces. So basically this upcoming show, they're all portrait style vertical pieces. And this happens to be one of them that's in this stacked perspective style. That's what I call it. Rather than 1 point or 2 point perspective, this is stacked, where it's actually taking you back in space, starting from the bottom portion of the painting all the way to the top. And the top piece, the top portion is certainly the furthest away in terms of depth. In terms of this piece, like I said, it's primarily blue. There's a lot of very cool colors. There's some green in there, a little bit yellow in the sky, but it's very calming. And it's pretty large, and it's probably the more meditative piece based on its kind of calming, cooling colors. Where the other one, that fire version, it's pretty intense. It still has that meditative quality, but because of the color, that red, it's so vibrant. Where this one's very calming. Mother of the Mountain, I should say, in terms of the pieces in the show, since they're very symmetrical, people do see things in these pieces. And it depends on, it's not even intentional sometimes. People might say, oh, I see bird wings, or is it a moth? Is it this? Is it that? What is it? For this one, I sent it to my brother in this kind of small image via text. And he said, oh, look, is that a woman? And I'm like, it wasn't intended to be a woman, but if that's what it shall be, that's what it shall be. This particular one seemed to feel more feminine than the other. And I think that some of it, there's like also a sense of mystery in this one and subtlety in this one versus the other, the fire version of it, right? The mountains and all the way in the back kind of very, very much disappear into the background. And, there's all these, leading all the way to the foreground where it's very defined. There's something more atmospheric about it as well than some of the other pieces in the show.
It's funny, you use the word meditative, which I agree with to an extent, and I don't want to make these limited perspective comparisons, but I've been watching a lot of Lord of the Rings recently.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's in terms of color palette and just kind of like, I agree, this feminine energy. something is wrong. Like when I look at it, I'm like, something unsettles me. It's, I don't know if there's like these layered mountains all the way in the back that almost like curve in towards the viewer.
Yeah.
There's like this eclipsed sun and
it's ominous, right?
Like it like pulls you and you're like, oh yes. And then you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
Like there's bodies in the bog on the way to Mordor. Like, no.
No, I think that observation is perfectly valid. I actually, in writing my statement for the show, I had mentioned that, one of the things that I love about creating these images, people see different things, as mentioned. It's actually very similar when, if you ever go to like Mount Denali, in Alaska, or any like major, mountain range. I went to Hawaii at some point, went to the top of a volcano, at 4:00 in the morning to see the sunrise, right? And it's kind of creepy, when you're up there, it's dark out and you're kind of waiting and everyone's kind of standing around waiting for this beautiful thing to reveal itself. But I believe that sometimes when people see something so beautiful or so just awe-inspiring, that some people are actually scared. Some people are overwhelmed. Some people feel small, right? And then other people might see it completely differently. That's so inspiring. It's something that's so grand that's beyond words. That's the other part of it. It's beyond words. So I think different life experiences as well. People experience things differently. Some people walk away from, a death in the family or a major life occurrence ruined, or some people end up really taking it as an experience. And so I'm going real deep on this piece here. But, I do think that you see what you see in the piece. But in my statement, I had mentioned that the intention is to be uplifting in this work. Because if you see the total body of work, there's lots of bright colors. This one happens to be very cooling, as very, very a calm color. But there is something unsettling because I can't help but somehow introducing this layer of drama into my pieces that sometimes feel unsettling,
Of course.
And it is intentional, right? So it's meditative, but it's also like a little scary. It could be overwhelming. But I think the unsettling quality to this one, there's sharp edges.
I think
yes.
Yeah, I would agree with
that. For as calming as you think it is, just the color palette, there's definitely some sharp edges.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the balance, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. It calls to mind a lot this idea of a mantra, right?
Yeah.
How in horror movies, the villains will often be chanting a mantra, but in meditation, you would be saying these words over and over and over again as well.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of a mantra in this very dualistic use.
Yes. Yeah, it's actually interesting. Like a lot of times the villain, like I'll tell you, villains from the 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was more appealing to me, the villain versus the hero. I always felt like the hero, as portrayed in lots of science fiction throughout that time frame, whether it's Star Wars, like Darth Vader. I have Darth Vader on my credit card, actually. People comment on all the time. Love Skeletor. All these villains are from a lot of the shows that I used to watch. They always had the monologues, right? They were always saying like the smart things, and then the hero of that time was like, "We're gonna win,"
The backstory and the character development of the villain is always better than the hero.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh yeah.
Even in Disney movies, the villain, they always nail the villain. It's always
so
amazing.
complex.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the show.
Yeah.
And then we can go from there.
Sure.
Great. So if you'd like to see this work in person, you have a show opening up at Arch Enemy Arts in Philadelphia on November 4th.
Yep. The show opens up this Friday, first Friday in Philadelphia. And the first Fridays in Philadelphia are definitely slightly different from the first Fridays here at the Banana Factory. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of college kids out, a lot of young professionals out and about. a lot of just art lovers in general. It's an old city, Philadelphia, and lots of galleries there. I'm hoping that First Friday is just as exciting. It's been a bunch of years since I had attended one in Philly, and of course, it's the first one. After, or can we say post-pandemic? Like I haven't been there since the pandemic for a First Friday, but I'm hoping that the turnout is good. Yes, and it'll be up for the month. I believe it comes down at the very end of November, and yeah.
That is awesome.
Wonderful.
And the name of the show is, one more time?
Mount Duality. Yeah. So, you can imagine, the symmetry of things, the two sides to every story, and a lot of the things that I already said about these classic themes that I really love that have two different meanings. I felt like because I've been doing these dual meaning pieces for so long, at least winking to that aspect of it in this new show, this whole idea that people see different things. Some people see it. I kind of told the story about if you and I are hanging out in front of a mountain range, we might completely have different emotions. And I do believe that when people see this work, people are going to feel differently about each piece. Whether it's the color or the hard edges of some of them or the softer edges of others. So yeah, this whole idea of duality, was certainly interesting to me. And I felt like calling it Mount something, this whole two-sided story. I went through many names as potential names for the show, but when I came up with that one, I'm like, I like that one. Just very simple, kind of to the point. But yeah.
Very cool.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
I love how well that encapsulates everything that we've talked about today too, with the duality of color, the duality of meaning in these different objects and creatures, everything down to, like you just said, these landscapes themselves. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. One of the things that on the piece that you're just interviewing me about, Mother of the Mountain, that sort of black sun in the background. There's 11 pieces in the show, 9 of which have a sun or a moon that's exactly the same size. So when you see them all together, that's like automatically a connection between all the work, except the 2 that will probably be at the end. Again, focusing on landscapes, sort of that stacked perspective. One of the initial names was going to be Portraits from an Unnatural World, because although it is based in nature, is it Earth? I don't know. Is it a different planet? I kind of like this idea of this sci-fi possibility. Like I've done shows before where it's like after it's done, you kind of lay it all out and like what if I didn't paint these? What if some other being painted these? Unbeknownst to me and using me as a vessel. So there's all these. I actually really like sci-fi. And the other thing about just my work in general, certainly in the new show, isn't different. The texture and although the colors are starting to advance and evolve and kind of go in different directions, the texture is still very much there. Mm-hmm. And seeing it on screen, like when you look at a lot of these pieces, seeing it on my social media, it's like, that's nice. But when you see it in person, it's this whole other experience where you kind of get lost in that texture. For sure. And, in terms of the overall artist statement of what I'm doing, this whole idea of my work, being weathered in that way, it looks like there's like history behind it. Like, where's that from? Was it done? Did you paint it yesterday, or was it painted 150 years or 500 years ago? Who knows? So, I had a local show at some point, and someone had come up to me and said, your work is is futuristic but ancient at the same time, you know. And it was something that kind of stuck with me. And I do feel like, you know, you're looking at that piece and you're like, that kind of looks like Lord of the Rings. You know, it's like classic, you know, it's timeless. It's, you know, maybe it wasn't done. Maybe it was actually published in the original Lord of the Rings book, you know, or something. You know, it has that kind of quality to it. So,
Well, if you'd like to see more of Doug's work, you can visit his website, dougboehm.com, DOUGBOEHM. And you also have an Instagram, which is at Doug Boehm Art. And your show at Arch Enemy Arts is opening November 4th and will be display all month till the end of November 2022. Highly recommend. It's a cool space. It's some pretty cool art. You should definitely check it out in person. Keep an eye out for it.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
very
Thank
cool.
you, Doug.
Thank you for having me.